James Day, public television pioneer and chairman of the CUNY TV Advisory Board, passed away in April 2008. His legacy includes the series Day at Night, which aired for 130 episodes beginning in 1973. The program features interviews with many of the great thinkers and achievers of the 20th century. These 30-year-old programs have been restored. The interviews remain fresh and relevant today, exploring issues that are still important to society. Showing them again is CUNY TV's tribute to Jim and his contributions to public television.
Irving Howe is a self-described man of the left, a democratic socialist, a radical. It wouldn't be too inconsiderate to describe him as an old-fashioned radical. He believes fervently in democracy and the democratic process, and is opposed to many of the tactics of the current crop of self-described radicals. Irving Howe is also a respected literary and social critic, a professor and an editor. For more than 10 years, he's taught English literature to students at Hunter College in New York, before that at Brandeis and Stanford. He's a frequent contributor to journals of thought and opinion, and the editor of one, Dissent. Of the spate of books he's written or edited, the most recently published is a collection of essays on literature and culture entitled The Critical Point. Mr. Howe, implicit in your criticism of American society is the vision of a better world. What is that better world that you can see ahead if we have the wit to perceive it and I suppose the will to change?
Well, it would be a better world in which there was more equality and in which the democratic process which functions politically would be extended to economic life and industrial society. That would be a shorthand way of putting it.
Is it achievable?
One tries. I don't know. There's no guarantee. It partly depends upon human effort. But I go on the assumption that if we have done things so far in human life, we can do some more as we go along.
Well, the idea of extending the democratic principle to economics and to a greater equality would seem on the surface to be an attractive idea. Why, if it's such an attractive idea, can't we achieve that?
Well, for one thing, it runs counter to many entrenched interests in the society. For another, there are ideological inhibitions against it. The remnants of individualism are still very strong in this world, in America. People think they're living by 19th century laissez-faire, even though they're not. I'll talk louder when we need to. All right?
I mean, we're not
living by 19th century laissez-faire.
We're not.
No.
What are we living by?
We're living by a mixed society, sort of welfare state, a little bit of the old, a little bit of the new mixed in, a kind of modified capitalism.
Do you think that we in this country are losing our faith in democratic institutions?
It's very hard to know. There is a whole sociological theory that modern industrial society leads to the growth of skepticism. People who live in cities and begin to disbelieve everything. And it's really hard to know, for example, whether Watergate has aroused indignation or just the feeling that they're all a bunch of crooks. And I don't suppose we will know until the elections, if we even know then. It's very hard to know what the root responses of people are to that kind of a thing. And yet I think somehow people do in America. I think it's one of the virtues of this country. People do think that democracy is a pretty good thing. And so far, we've managed to keep it.
How do you sense that?
Well, I sense that because they avoid various kinds of extremes. They're sensible about not going for charismatic, dictatorial types. They often make mistakes, but still stay within the bounds of it. And there's a fair degree, a reasonable amount of fair play. for people of dissident views. Not always, of course. There are a lot of violations of democracy, but in my debates with New Left students, I often had to explain that the fact that we have a violation of democracy does not mean that democracy is absent. And on the contrary, it means that we have it, but it's being violated, it's being distorted or marred, but it's there. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you find in your discussions with these students and young New Leftists a loss of confidence in reason to meet our problems?
There is that element. Of course, there really isn't much of a New Left around anymore. Yeah, we're still just chatting, huh?
No, we're serious about this.
Yeah, okay. Mm-hmm. There is certainly a loss of reason. There's an element of that, but nevertheless, I think there is some element of that. Yeah.
Why?
Well, reason is something which takes a very considerable degree of sophistication to believe in, and there have been experiences in the 20th century which manifestly run counter to any hope of reasonable ways of handling problems. Totalitarianism, things that have happened in Europe in the last 40, 50 years seem so inconceivable to the mind, to the reasonable procedures, that many people feel indeed that it is impossible to deal with serious problems through the use of reason.
So they turn.
Yeah, they turn to
feeling,
to irrationality, to mysticism, and the like. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I want to ask you about your own growing up here in New York City. You said that a world I never made me.
Yes.
What was that world that made you? You grew up in the East Bronx, in what you called a Jewish slum.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I grew up in a Jewish working-class immigrant neighborhood in which, for a considerable period of time, one lived in a very self-enclosed world. It was very poor, but there was a great deal of psychic and emotional coherence and closeness. It was a world in which socialism was taken very seriously, fervently, ardently, and though the final conditions of one's life in that world were not made by me, were not made by my parents, though the Depression came and was terribly destructive and damaged our lives, nevertheless, we felt that we had certain values that mattered to us.
What were those values?
Well, they were the values of what is called in Yiddish Menschlichkeit, which means humaneness, being decent, being good to other people, believing that the traditions, for example, of Jewish socialism had something to offer the world. There was a sense of closeness, the sense of belonging to a people which had suffered a great deal and been persecuted, and which nevertheless managed to survive, and even to survive with a little bit of mother wit and humor. And there was a great, intense respect for learning. Well, the kinds of people whom I grew up with were not very learned themselves. They were mostly poor immigrant workers, but they were desperately intent, at the cost of great sacrifice, that their children should learn. And indeed, the whole generation to which I belong went to college at great cost, at great sacrifice, and we did learn things.
What about the schools? You went to public school?
Yes, we went to public school.
One hears today that public schools in large cities are...
The schools were very, very good. Mm-hmm. The schools were wonderful, I think.
They were?
Yeah. Well, don't forget, in 1935 or 6, when I was going to high school, at that point, if you had a job as a high school teacher for $40 a week, and the $40 came in regularly, you were considered in a very fortunate position. You were even able to go to Europe every other summer. And this was looked upon as an enviable job. And as a consequence, there were the kinds of people who today are teaching in college, or should be teaching in college, were then teaching in high schools, considered themselves lucky to have these jobs. And the quality of the high schools was very, very high. I would say that some of the teachers I had in high school are better than a good many I have since encountered in college. Also, the students were very eager, very highly motivated and intense, and so I feel that I probably learned more in high school than I did afterward. Yeah.
You said that it was, of course, during the Depression that you lived in some poverty, but you've written that you weren't really aware of poverty as you experienced it. You become aware of poverty after you grow up and realize what you've gone through.
Not quite that way. You become aware of poverty as an idea. I remember as a boy, of perhaps 15, reading some articles by Sherwood Anderson, a writer whom I loved very much and about whom afterwards I wrote a book. Anderson had gone down to some textile mills in North Carolina, and he described the terrible poverty of striking textile workers. And I read this, and I was tremendously moved by it. And then suddenly it occurred to me that the conditions that we were living in, while perhaps a little better than those of the textile workers, were not very much better, that we also were living in poverty. That is, one had to have the generalized idea of poverty to be able to put the label upon one's own experiences. You need some capacity for reflection and thought, and it was in this way that reading these articles by a writer whom I knew nothing about enabled me to understand something about the experience we were going through.
What was your reaction when you understood?
Well, when I understood, I had some sense of first a little bit of self-pity, but then afterwards of indignation, and also a feeling that our own experience in the slums in the East Bronx were not all that different from those of other people. Finally, it had a kind of liberating experience. It enabled one to see that one's life was shared with that of other people.
You use one expression in this essay about your life in the 30s, which surprised me. That you felt a certainty bordering on comfort, that you'd never find a regular job.
Yes. Well,
what did you mean by that?
Well, when I grew up, and I went to college between 36 and 1940, careerism, in the sense that one has encountered it since, wasn't much of a problem, because there was a complete assurance that we felt, people like myself and my friends, that we would graduate from college and then be unemployed. We had no idea that there were any possibilities open for us for careers or making money, and consequently we didn't worry about it. You know, when you had no money at all, then you didn't worry about money. And in some sense, you were more light-hearted as a consequence. Also light-headed, perhaps.
You speak of the importance in your growing up of the movement.
Yeah.
What was the movement?
The movement was the socialist movement, various branches of it, and that becomes too complex and recondite to go into here. But essentially, it was the socialist movement, as essentially at that point the movement of Norman Thomas, to which I became attached as a very young person, and which has really since been the basic formative factor in my whole experience. Though my ideas have changed and become more complicated, that original allegiance remains.
But you referred to the movement as a school for politics as well as a school for life.
It was a school for many things. It was a school for politics. It was a school which taught one to speak. It taught one Robert's Rules of Order. It taught one manners, sometimes bad manners. It taught one how to read. It even introduced me to culture. In a curious way, I came to James Joyce through various radical friends of mine who sneered at my low tastes, and not wanting to have lower taste than anyone else, I simply then proceeded to read these advanced books that they told me about. They told me about Edmund Wilson's Axel's Castle when I was 16 or 17, so I read it.
What about economics?
Economics was for me always a somewhat dull matter.
Can one be a socialist and think of economics as being dull?
Yes, life is full of contradictions, I suppose. Yes, I never was very good at it. I made ardent efforts, and I certainly went through the whole first volume of Capital later on, but I cannot pretend to be a very good economist.
What about the radical movement today, Mr. Howe?
There isn't any radical movement today in the sense that one speaks of it in the past in America, you know, parties of some substance. There are little groups, there are little tendencies. There are groups, for example, such as those of us who are around the quarterly magazine, which I edit, Dissent, which is now entering its 20th anniversary. And such groups try to maintain and revive the essential ideas of socialism and such things, but there is no really significant, in my mind, no significant socialist movement in America today, unfortunately.
Is the radical movement and the socialist movement the same thing? What about
as I use it, yes.
Well, I see as you use it. What about the, I recall rather vividly meeting you one evening on the Stanford campus several years ago when you took on what were then known as the campus radicals. And you were quite at odds with the campus radicals.
Yes, I was at odds with the New Left people, and I think experience has shown, by and large, I think that I was right as against them. I believe that their vision was apocalyptic, that they were succumbing to authoritarian ideas, that they were unrealistic about the possibilities of American politics, that they underestimated the value of democracy in America. And I still would say that. I think there were some very strong and valuable idealistic impulses behind the New Left, and from my point of view, it's a tragedy that it all disappeared and that it reenacted the characteristic rhythm of American radicalism, which is an upsurge of enthusiasm and idealism, and then a disintegration, the sense of waste and loss.
Why did it have these characteristics? Was it it was essentially, I suppose, a middle-class group of students that were at the heart of it, was it not?
Yes, essentially it was a middle-class group of students. I'd say it had the characteristics of desperation and excess, partly because of what you've just said, that it was middle-class students who didn't have enough basis in reality, who sneered, for example, at the desires of workers for a higher minimum wage. Well, their daddies didn't need a higher minimum wage, but millions of workers do and did need a higher minimum wage. Also, it took on characteristics of desperation because of the Vietnam War, to which I was also opposed, as they were, and they felt somehow that they were banging their head against the wall, that they had no effect, and this made them raise the ante, so to speak, as they went along. Well, it turned out that the opposition to the war did have an effect, and I think there again they were wrong. There's also something inherent about student radicalism, that it tends to be short-lived. It flares up and then they graduate and get jobs and get lost.
What about the element of shock?
In what sense?
Well, their tactics seem to center around shocking.
Yeah, I didn't believe in that very much because, for one thing, in the culture we live in, shock has by now become so absorbed into the essence of things. It's hard to imagine, for example, what on Broadway, say, could prove to be shocking. If you walk out of the Graduate Center of the City University where I teach and you go along 42nd Street, what could possibly shock you after that? And it's true that for a while the New Left kids did succeed in shocking some people, but the shock also brought about a terrible counter-reaction, a terrible backlash. Well, this atrocious kidnapping, for example, of Patricia Hearst has no doubt had a certain shock effect, but I suspect if it conforms to all past experience, the final effect of it will be to strengthen the right, not the left.
Why do you suppose student radicals took on the tactic of shock? Why that tactic?
Well, partly, you know, épater le bourgeois, partly to aggravate their parents. One finds that there is that element. And I say also partly because there was no sustained radical tradition in America. There had been a rupture in the tradition of American socialism, and so there wasn't a controlling and guiding norm by which they could work. They had to sort of improvise on their own, and they went berserk under the desperation of Vietnam. And also there were models from abroad, inappropriate in my judgment to America, like Che Guevara and others such, and there were fantasies of identification of that sort together with the genuine intrinsic idealism.
What about the idealism of young people today? You're in contact with them. Are they idealistic, or have they lost their idealism to a very large
It's hard
extent?
to say. It's very hard to say. There's not much political activism on the campus at this present moment, but I would say that some residues, some elements of that must remain. And if, for example, there were a candidate in the next national election who represented what the young people would feel, what I would feel too, was a genuine sort of left liberal impulse for social change and for moral regeneration in the country, I think we'd find that thousands of kids would once again be out on the hustings, as would I.
You've referred to education today as schizoid, as in a sense moving in two opposite directions at the same time.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, we're trying to do two things, both of which I believe in principle, but which I recognize in practice may at the given moment be almost irreconcilable. We're trying on the one hand to maintain the tradition, say in what I teach in English literature, we're trying to maintain the tradition of seriousness and scholarship and excellence and quality. And without that, there isn't any education. And at the same time, we're trying to engage in a mass diffusion. This is a very great experiment, one of the most remarkable things that's happened in this country, toward which I take essentially a positive view. That is, suddenly the idea arises that almost everybody has a right, and almost everybody uses the right to go to college. Well, to do one thing, which is the traditional view of education, and to do the other, which is sort of the new mass view of education, to do it at the same time, and not even to know, as many people involved in education don't know, that there is a terrible clash here, a terrible tension, often not to have enough money and resources and skill and qualified teachers, is an incredibly difficult thing. Also, this is a very impatient country. We want things to be done in a short while. Whereas this experiment in mass education, if it's going to work, would have to take, in my judgment, decades before one could even make a preliminary judgment. So that, for example, the open enrollment program that we have in the City University, it's utterly absurd to make any judgment of it, whatever, thus far, because...
Do you still take a positive view in the long run?
Yes, yes. I take a positive view of the open enrollment program, though I am critical of some of the accompanying ideological carrying on and publicity, and I'm critical of those who toot a horn as if the open enrollment program raises no difficulties for us in continuing to maintain a serious college. There's no question in my judgment that the open enrollment programs have created very serious deficiencies and problems in the colleges. I think above all, one has to be honest, one has to be candid, and not to smear things over with publicity, and to recognize that we are caught here in a contradiction, that we're trying to do two things which may be reconcilable in the long run, but which in the short run create terrible tensions.
I suppose that would be true of most changes, though, wouldn't it?
Yeah,
in a democratic society.
Yeah, I suppose that's right.
What is the proper role of a university in your view?
In America today? Well, I tend to have a fairly traditionalist view of the university. I would like the university to be, above all, a place where the past is brought to life. This country has so little sense of the cultural value, the cultural livingness of the past, of the great books of the past, the great ideas, the great achievements of the past, where they would come to seem an actuality, a part of our living experience. And that means, for example, to teach Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, not comic books. Well, that seems to me the essential role of the university, to make, as I even take Matthew Arnold's phrase, to make available the best that has been thought and said and done in the past. I share many of the social activist impulses of some students, and I think I have been a social activist in my own life, and there is room for that in the university, but not if it, in my judgment, if it undermines the essential task of learning and scholarship. I don't think the university is by itself a very good agency for social change. I think if you want social change, you have to go out into the world and fight for it there.
But you wouldn't exclude its students from taking part in it?
They're citizens, they're free people, they have a right to engage in politics if they want to. But they don't have a right, and this no longer occurs, it did some time back, they don't have a right, for example, to interfere with educational work in the name of social change.
You describe yourself as a radical. A radical change always at least suggests sudden change, and sudden change does not happen, nor is it likely to happen. Can you be a radical and still maintain an optimism about the future?
Well, by radical, I don't mean the thing which, you know, the popular press envisages, or perhaps a lot of people share in their fantasies. I mean by radical the desire to see deep-going social changes of a democratic and egalitarian kind in American society within the structure of American democracy. Can one be an optimist about this? Well, I'm old enough now to remember a time when people thought that Social Security and unemployment insurance and old age pensions were the most confounded, outrageous notions imported from Moscow, etc., etc. And now what strikes me is that many of our kids take these things so completely for granted that one has to explain to them that there was a time when people fought politically through trade unions, through parties, that you had to go out and fight for these things. Well, that's, I suppose, a sign of progress, though it also can irritate you in some ways. And
there's still people who are opposed to those changes, I suppose.
Right. And now, for example, if we say we believe that the corporations should be democratically run, that workers and corporations should have a say in their own fate, and that the public should have a say in what happens with the corporations or corporations, things like that, this strikes some people as preposterous, and yet it's entirely possible 30, 40 years from now it will, at least in part, have become an element in our political experience.
What about your own faith in the democratic institutions?
The one thing that I've learned, and it's been at some considerable cost in revising my ideas and in thinking things through, that is that freedom, democracy is for intellectuals and for non-intellectuals too, the one absolutely indispensable thing. I oppose anyone who in the name of some better world proposes to destroy the freedoms that we have. I want to see those freedoms expanded, enlarged, improved, and purified, but in order to do that, they first have to be preserved. That's why people say like Solzhenitsyn and Sakharov in Russia are for me tremendously moving. I look upon them as my comrades, my friends.
Thank you very much.